The Coalition of Texans with Disabilities, Raise Your Voice 2022, Youth Justice, October 24th, 2022.
Thanks, Jolene. My name is Jennifer Toon, and I am the Policy Fellow here at CTD. I am an attractive white woman with short hair with a very nice pressed shirt on today. I did change out of my Taylor Swift hoodie for the first time in 3 days. So I'm here. I'm excited about the conversation. And I'm really excited to have some partners of ours to be able to really just do a deep dive into our campaign around TJJD. That is the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. So yeah, before I let Alycia tell us all about herself and her work and what we're doing here, I'm going to give you a little bit of a background to youth justice in the state of Texas. And I want to recommend a book. It's called Who Gets a Childhood by William Bush. It gives an extremely great overview of all the intricate ins and outs of the youth justice in Texas, and all, unfortunately, the histories of scandals. I don't know if any of you have seen, those of you that don't work on youth justice, if you've recently seen the investigations that have happened over the past year about the horrid, inhumane conditions that are going on in TJJD, the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, formerly known as the Texas Youth Commission. This agency goes way back to 1949. It was called the Texas Youth Developmental Council. It was officially renamed the Texas Youth Commission back in the early 80s. And then it was merged with the Texas Juvenile Probation Department in 2011 and into its current form, TJJD. Now, if the recent crisis, what's happening in this system is nothing new, unfortunately, for those of us who have experience in that system. I was a child in the early 90s, and I was in the Texas Youth Commission. And those tragedies and indignities and lack of treatment existed even then. And you can trace it back further back in the history. But most recently, it comes to mind of around 2006, 2007, there was a huge scandal, child abuse scandal in the Texas Youth Commission. And that has progressed for many years with legislators saying, with this, we won't stand for this, something has to change. And it seems like we continue to do the same thing over and over, expecting different results in our juvenile justice system. So I would like Alycia, if you can, and we also have Sarah Reyes here. We're going to have a big open conversation after these ladies present and talk to us, and then we're just going to have an open discussion, general questions about youth justice and about the campaign that we're all going to be working on to close these facilities. So Alycia, tell us, we know the crisis is there, and we know that kids with disabilities and mental health issues suffer the worst in these systems because they're not getting the treatment that they desperately need. And that TJD has pretty much become a dumping ground over the years for children. So what's the plan to do with these 5 state facilities that are deeply in crisis because of staffing, lack of programming, and just dismal conditions?
Yeah, great question, Jen. And first, I'll just introduce myself, and let you know I might have to go off camera because of Wi-Fi issues. But before that, I am a Hispanic woman with a black shirt and my gold hoops, with the background of my office. So I'll go off camera now so I don't start cutting out. Thank you, Sarah. That's also true. I am, I like to consider, some might consider me attractive as well. So we have been working hard campaign that meets the moment that we're in right now, where kids are really suffering at TJJD, like Jen mentioned, at the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. And so for a long time, our organization and folks like us have been thinking that it doesn't make sense to incarcerate children, period, right? But it didn't really seem like it seemed like a long road that we have to take before we can start to imagine what a state might look like without these prisons, these facilities where we are locking up kids, and really the most vulnerable kids. And before we go much further into, discussion about policy or campaigns or anything like that, I think it is good for us to just center on who the kids are, right? So the kids who go to TJJD are truly the most vulnerable kids in Texas. We know that approximately 88%, but probably closer to all, kids in TJJD have one or more adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences are traumatic events in a child's life that we know based on neuroscience and child development can create really negative impacts for their development. And more than half of them have multiple adverse childhood experiences. And so just starting with trauma, these are the most traumatized kids in Texas. And then talking about mental health needs, we know that at least 60% of the kids have been diagnosed with a severe mental health issue. And then another percentage of those having a very severe mental health issue, talking about things like psychosis, nonverbal autism, non-speaking autism, different disabilities that it really impact their mental health. And then speaking about other types of disabilities, we know that about 23% of the kids in TJJD have a reported intellectual disability or developmental disability, but also that the average child in TJJD is about 5 grades behind their peers. So that, the reported number might be different than the actual number. And lastly, just one point about the vulnerability of these kids is that the vast majority of the girls, almost 100% of them, have concern for commercial sexual exploitation, or in layman's terms, sex trafficking. So all of that being said, a lot of times we have kids who get in trouble and they end up standing before a judge, and a judge says, maybe prison isn't the most appropriate place for this child, but I don't have anywhere else to send them. So that's what we're going to do. And that's what's led us to the mess that we're in now. And you asked me what we're going to do about it, so I can talk about that. So like I mentioned before, when we know about the negative impacts of youth incarceration. The kids who already have trauma are having compounded trauma in these cages. But in addition to that, there's no true accountability that's occurring at TJJD. So for kids who have harmed people in their communities, they're not able to make amends from behind the walls of a prison cell. And in fact, that compounding trauma is making it more difficult for them to ever be able to restore those relationships as they might like to. And then we know that there are also lifelong consequences of the trauma that occurs behind those walls, as well as the difficulty of carrying something like an arrest record. Now, youth in Texas are supposed to be able to steal those records, but we also know that many of the children who end up in TJJD will go back and will end up in the adult system. And so the lifelong consequences of carrying an adult criminal record is something that they also are at much higher rates likely to experience. And lastly, just as overall community impact with the problem of youth incarceration, is that this is a really high cost practice, not only financially, right, but when we're talking about human lives. And there's no return. So broadly, agencies, government entities, even some whole countries have realized that there's no benefit to this. There's no public safety benefit to incarcerating children, because all of these children will one day or another be back in their communities. And so the question is whether they'll return victimized and more traumatized than they went in, or if we're going to choose to do something different. So we say, let's do something different. All of those facts being in place, let's do something different. So the question that inevitably comes up is, if not youth prisons, then what? And so we're recommending more of what I'm calling an abolitionist model. So we know that some countries, some industrialized countries, don't even have a juvenile justice system. They don't have to deal with these problems that we're dealing with now. And so what would it look like for Texas to aim for that same model? And we believe it starts with these three things. Number one, shut the prisons. Any state who has made successful strides towards youth decarceration has made a clear commitment to closing the prisons. It's come from the governor, right? And in fact, Texas actually did this not long ago. In 2007, all the way up to 2011, there was a similar thing going on in the environment, and it was that there were scandals that were reported on that were occurring behind the walls at TJJD. And so the legislature decided, let's decriminalize these kids and shut these prisons down. And so we were able to close about 9 facilities at that time. So and we went from an incarceration, thousands of kids who were incarcerated, down to the number that we have now, which is closer to 600. So we've done it before. This is not anything new. We can do it again, but we have to commit to doing it. Number two, all the tens of millions of dollars that are going to be saved from closing prisons should be reinvested in the strategies that are most effective for preventing youth violence and youth crime and keeping kids in their communities safe. So we think that those funds should be reinvested in community-based solutions for youth and community wellness. And lastly, there's going to need to be a slate of policy that seeks to decriminalize youth altogether in order for this to be successful. Back during our last kind of era of reform in Texas, one of the things that led to the massive decrease in incarceration was that the legislature passed a bill that said that you can't incarcerate a child for a misdemeanor. So instantly that eliminated so many, about half of the kids that were incarcerated altogether. So what would it look like for Texas to say, we'll never incarcerate a kid for using drugs? We'll never incarcerate a kid for something that's happening, in their families that could be resolved with counseling and mediation, right? So those are the types of policies that we would be advocating for at the Capitol for the legislature to pass once again. And Jolene asked a little bit about the ages of these children. And so unfortunately, Texas can incarcerate children as young as 10 years old. The children who are 10, 11, 12 years old, they're little kids. And, some of our colleagues on visits to facilities where they're housed have noticed they're so small, they walk around holding the hands of the correctional officers or with a teddy bear in their arm. We're talking about really little kids. And then we incarcerate in the youth justice system up to 16-year-olds. So Texas is one of the few states that treats 17-year-olds as minors for everything except criminal legal purposes. So 17-year-olds are charged as adults in Texas, but the majority of kids in TJJD will be those older teenagers who haven't gotten the resources that they deserve in their own communities. So that's a very brief overview. I have a policy brief and slides even that I could share with you all to kind of give a better overview or a more tangible visual overview, if that's helpful for folks as well.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Jolene. Can you speak to past or even potential policy changes that are or initiatives to raise the age for those children? I mean, ideally, we're just not going to be incarcerating children, but can you kind of speak to what has been done or tried up to this point?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are two issues surrounding raise the age, right? We have this issue of raising the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction, and then the issue of raising the minimum age for adult jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction, right? So the more common issue that we talk about is that upper age. There have been efforts for years and years to ensure that 17-year-olds can be adjudicated within the juvenile justice system, because 17-year-olds are kids. I think we all remember being 17 and know that an adult prison was not the place that we would have been able to be successful, right? So unfortunately, because of the state of things at the Juvenile Justice Department right now, there doesn't seem to be a path forward for raising the age, that upper age of juvenile jurisdiction for this legislative session. The staffing crisis is so to such an extreme that it's something that no one is willing to consider. And in fact, we ought to question ourselves, what it would look like for TJJD to absorb all those kids in this state, as things are. So that's a little bit about that. And then for raising the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction, that's something that there might be an appetite for this legislative session, changing that minimum age from 10 years old to 12 or 13 years old. This is something that other states are working on at the same time as us, and it's something that we're actually not the worst on this issue. Some states actually can incarcerate kids as young as 6 or 7, if you can believe it. So that is something that we will be in support of this legislative session as well.
Can you just share what has been, in terms of raising the age for that younger group, what has been the pushback, or has there been pushback?
Unfortunately, there has been pushback, and it goes back to that same question that I mentioned earlier. If not prison, then what? And so communities oftentimes feel that they don't have the resources they need to adequately treat children who are struggling with really difficult mental health issues or behavioral issues that result in the activities that cause their incarceration. So in some cases, that might be true. Texas doesn't have the local infrastructure that it needs, that children need, right? We are one of the last states to refuse to expand Medicaid. And we have the highest uninsured rate of children in the country. So of course, counties struggle with finding resources that children need, especially because so many of the children don't have access to to healthcare at all.
It's an excellent point. Renee, you have your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you closed down those places, what happened to the children? Where did they go?
So when we closed them down in the past, a lot of times kids went home. A lot of times, especially because we're talking about kids who, it shouldn't have been in prison in the first place at all, right? And that was simple to see, right? So a lot of those children went home. And in this case, what we're proposing now for their kids who are there is, number one size does legislators ask, if not prison, then what? We say, well, let's talk about it, because there are a lot of different things and a lot of different needs that kids have. So one of the solutions that we're proposing is to create an Office of Youth and Community Restoration under the umbrella of the Health and Human Services Commission in Texas. So if we truly believe, like the research shows and all the evidence we have shows, that youth crime and youth violence is a public health issue, then why shouldn't we use a public health response to meet those needs, right? So the entity that is responsible for public health is a better suited entity to provide the resources or help develop the resources that youth need to thrive in their own communities. And so for most kids, they'll be able to go home with the resources that they need, and they'll do well. And we have an example of that in Harris County for the first time. So in Harris County in 2020, we discovered that at their youth jail, they were holding kids for 23 hours a day in their cells because of staffing shortages, the pandemic. They thought that that would be best for medical isolation to stop the spread of COVID back in those early days when we didn't know as much as we know now. And so a group of advocates came together and said, you can't do that, or there are going to be lawsuits. And so they said, well, we'll figure this out then. And we worked with community-based service providers on the ground in Harris County to kind of reach an agreement that if the Harris County Juvenile Probation Department would release all the kids that they could, that these community-based service providers would come together to serve them in their own homes. And so that meant bringing a hot meal by every single day. That meant helping them with their technology to be able to do online school, right, when their schools shut down. That meant counseling services, and sometimes for the whole family if that's what was needed. And it was really successful. So out of the approximately 80 kids that were released, only 6 were rearrested within the first 6 months, which is impressive when we're talking about recidivism rates, right? And there are other metrics of success, but that gives us one example of how this can work in actually Texas's most difficult county for or rather this county sends the most kids to TJJD. So if we can do it there, we can do it other places.
Thank you, Alycia. You are always so elegant in explaining kind of complex, but, you know, really simple answers. Like Representative Swanson said, maybe it's time that we treat, you know, children like they're people. And as somebody that's been in that system, when there's not staff and doing things the old way, you're absolutely right. Kids leave the system more harmed and traumatized and end up in the adult system, which is exactly what happened to me. So I do want to touch on something, and it may be in people's thoughts right now, but I certainly know it's on some of the questions legislators ask us when we propose this grand, beautiful new vision of, youth justice and criminal justice as a whole. Like when we continue to do the same things and it's not producing good outcomes, but you mentioned some stuff that is working. But let's talk about that core group of kids. As you said, we get that population down through decriminalizing things that children do, because it is very much a health issue. It is very much a public health issue. All the girls that I was locked up with, even those that, like myself, that did something very intense, was rooted in a health issue. It was rooted in mental health. It was rooted in trauma and other things. And as children, you're just held in a different way accountable than adults because we were kids, right? So what about that population? Because we're going to get asked that, right? What about that core population of kids that have done something, very serious, that they can't go directly home, they can't go to community care, they can't? Where do those kids go?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. It's the one that's on, like you said, it's on everyone's minds when we
They
talk
ask us every hearing, what happens with those kids? Okay, you got the population down and kids are getting, I feel like everyone, legislators and the public, are on board with everything that you discussed, right? We've got a new vision. We've got things that work. We've closed facilities before. Crime rate didn't skyrocket. We got kids into service. We've got a program in Harris County, like you said, one of the really toughest places to do that. We've had success, but the question always comes back to, okay, well, you still got, even if you got it down to a handful of kids, what do you do with those kids that commit serious offenses? Where do they go?
Yeah, so a couple things to just kind of level set, when we even attempt to answer that question. And number one is that it will never be justified what we're doing to these 600 kids, for the handful, and we're talking about less than 10 single digits of kids who create devastating harm in communities, right? So that's something that, across the board, I think we could agree with. But the second thing is that it really is a handful of kids. It really is, when we're talking about youth crime, ultimately, we're talking about drug offenses. We're talking about fights at school. We're talking about petty theft. That's the vast majority of the cases that kids are coming in with, right? So it is important for us to realize that those very few kids who commit devastating harm are the kids who are most in need of age-appropriate, developmentally, and just appropriate treatment for what's going on in their lives. I think we all agree that no child is born a murderer. Inevitably, in those children's lives, if you interview them or read interviews from them, you'll find that the devastation that began in their lives started with them as the victim, right? So all that being said, it doesn't release them of accountability for the actions that they've the harm that they've caused. So in order to appropriately address that, sometimes kids are in such a state of crisis that they will need to be in a safe and secure place to receive the treatment that they need to lead the lives that they want to lead and to become successful contributing members in their societies, right, in their communities. So if we do have to ensure that there is a safe and secure place for those few kids, shouldn't that place be under the purview of a public health entity rather than a criminal one? If we agree that these are all children that are facing crisis and often mental health crisis, we need to respond to that appropriately, because like I said before, we abolished life in prison for children. So that's not going to happen. These children will be released one day. And we have to ensure that they will be healthy and able to adapt safely to their environments once they are released. And that should be done under the care of medical health professionals and mental health professionals, not under the care of a correctional officer who makes $35,000 a year and has to take care of many other kids at the same time.
No, I appreciate you clarifying that, because we've talked in the past before about how that is a sticking point, and in some other advocates don't know how to answer that, or don't want to acknowledge that there are kids that need exactly what you said, a secure, safe setting, who are in crisis, to be able to receive the treatment that they need, and certainly not in the settings at these 5 state facilities that TJJD currently operates, where we read in the report that children are urinating in bottles and they're not able to get out to go to the bathroom, in decades and decades of sexual abuse and abuse and neglect, period. And I've mentioned this before to legislators. When children can't trust you, therapy is not going to work. I relate that to my lived experiences, that when these things were happening to us in a facility that was in rural West Texas, with not a lot of oversight, with a culture of predatory behavior from the staff, they would do these things that we see going on right now to us. And then 3 or 4 days later, want us to go to the group room and do therapy and talk about our lives and the stuff that brought us to there to begin with. And many times we would get in trouble because we refused to speak. We would all sit together and agree to be silent, and they would take us back to our rooms and punish us again. Because if children can't trust you, why in the world am I going to trust you to do this really deep, painful, therapeutic work with the very hand that is abusing me at the same time? Because that is what is happening in TJJD. It is abuse. Because if parents were doing the things that the state is doing to these kids, and absolutely, I love that you made that point of there is no justification what's happening to those 600 children on the basis of a few anyway. There's no justification for that. But if parents were doing this to their kids, they would have already been charged with neglect and abuse. So I appreciate that you were able to explain the hard questions, the hard answers that other advocates would often ask, legislators would ask. Does anyone else have any other questions? We can open it up for a group discussion. Jolene, if you had anything that you wanted to add.
No, I just wanted to ask, when we're talking about kids with disabilities, we often see them, just like students of color, disproportionately funneled into that school to prison pipeline. And sometimes, that may be for lack of services and supports. It may be for behaviors that are a manifestation of a disability. But when this happens, can you kind of talk about in terms of accommodations, modifications that we know or do apply, under federal law do apply, within these settings, but what does that actually look like for people with disabilities? I think I know the answer to this, but Jen,
Jen, do you want to take the first stab at that?
Well, I know from, as a person in those systems, with the women around me and myself and the girls around me, those accommodations don't exist. I mean, they can exist on paper, but the state is often not held accountable, and there's no independent oversight in a way to ensure that those things are happening. So while policy on paper can say that they are, they just don't.
Yeah, that's what I've found as well. And one example is in that stat that I mentioned earlier. The TJJD reports that 23% of their kids have an intellectual or developmental disability, and yet we know that most of the kids there are at least 5 grades behind their peers. We're talking about a 6th grader reading at a 1st grade level. That's as a former teacher and a teacher of children with intellectual disabilities, I know that that's indicative of probably something broader than a lack of services, or maybe that kid going to a bad school. So the reporting creates a real problem for ensuring oversight wherever there are supposed to be accommodations.
Well, and mentioning the school to prison pipeline, Alycia, how often are the kids that end up, and I know that previous reform has really brought the population down, thank God, but the kids that end up in TJJD from some type of offense that happened at school, because that's where we see a lot of our kids with disabilities touching with the juvenile justice system. What would you think the percentage of that is, or the estimate is, of how many of those kids actually end up being in the justice system?
Ooh, I have that number actually.
Yeah.
I just need to find it. I don't have it right in front of me, but it is a lot of kids. So the majority of kids who go to TJJD go from a law enforcement encounter. And so again, back to the reporting, that's a little tricky, because it won't be counted if that was like in the school. It won't be counted as a law enforcement encounter necessarily, but it could be if they were on the grounds of the school after school hours, right? That would be a law enforcement interaction rather than like a school-based interaction. So the next most common, though, way that kids end up in TJJD is from those behaviors that occurred in the classroom. And so when we discuss the school to prison pipeline, a lot of times we talk about how exclusionary discipline just sets kids up on the path for incarceration. And so we know that kids with intellectual disabilities and kids who are LGBTQ, and definitely, like you mentioned, Jolene, Black kids and brown kids are more likely to be removed from their classrooms for basic standard childhood behavior, just at disproportionate rates than their white, wealthy, non neurotypical peers, right? So that is a huge challenge, and one of the things that we'll be asking the legislature to address. So if it's the second most common, referral place, if we were to eliminate incarceration from the school to prison pipeline altogether, that alone would eliminate so much of the this question of what do we do with the kids, because they would have never interacted with the system at all. And some of the ways that we can do that is by, when I mentioned that reinvestment strategy, is taking the money that we're spending on the punishment system and investing it in places like our schools. So I mentioned before, yes, health and human services, but so much of this happening at schools could be addressed in schools. And one of the challenges is that we know teachers are stretched beyond their capacity at this point, right? And so rather than asking teachers to add yet another training to their, development during the summer, what we'd be asking for is for the legislature to invest in some of those things that already exist in schools. What would it look like for us to have a stronger focus on social emotional learning, which is a requirement of the standards for teaching in Texas. But we don't focus on it because we focus on so many other things that are going to be on a test, right? So what would it look like for us to prioritize that, or for us to create better investments in programs like communities and schools, where there are social workers on campus ready to talk to any student who's struggling? What would it look like for us to eliminate in-school suspension and instead treat classroom misbehaviors as a learning opportunity? And so I know that those are big claims, but I feel confident making them because I was a teacher, and it worked in my classroom because I happened to work for a school that where we didn't use exclusionary discipline. And so it shouldn't just be the wealthy children who were able to go to my school that have that opportunity. It should be every school that is equipped with what they need to be able to turn challenges into learning opportunities. I see Renee's hand is raised.
Yeah, some of these kids have diagnosis. Does the diagnosis go with them when they go into the system? Or, that some of the children that are in there may have autism or intellectual disabilities, or, and they might be in the 504 or the special education. Does that follow them into the system?
Yes.
Go ahead.
No. Yes, that's an excellent question. And I was going to ask Jen to touch on that as well. It does. And it was codified in statute. Was it two sessions ago? Representative Tallarico filed a bill, HB 30, that explicitly said, hey, every kid, has an opportunity to get their diploma. And that includes providing services, those provisions under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is federal law. Those services and supports are supposed to be provided as well. So if a student has an individual education plan or an IEP, those things are also supposed to be provided. Now, where it gets a little tricky at TJJD is that in public education, the Texas Education Agency is the regulatory body. So they're the ones who are monitoring compliance. They're the ones regulating, and ensuring that, that districts across the state and charter schools are complying. However, their role within juvenile justice alternative education programs, or JJAEPs, sorry for throwing so many acronyms out, is really more of a consulting role. So they're not the oversight agency. So, and then again, we know in Texas that we have so many kids who are under-identified. We have a long history of delaying and denying special education services to eligible students. And in some cases, that's the root of the problem, is that they're not getting the services and the supports that they're entitled to. And again, some of these behaviors become, they're a manifestation of the disability that's not being supported. But yes, I guess short answer is yes, all of those things are supposed to follow that individual.
I think what is shocking to people is that when it does follow, because it doesn't always, because they retest you, they do their own assessments once you get there. They may have records from the school or from a private therapist or doctor. They're going to do their own assessments anyway. But I think what is shocking for people that are just learning about the juvenile justice system and the criminal justice system as a whole is that even when those diagnoses are known, so what? I mean, I'm not saying that to be callous, but that is how the system treats you. That's how they treat children, just like they do adults. I will provide what I am mandated by law to do, but it's going to be pretty minimum. It's going to be not personalized or person-centered. It's a one size fits all. And if you don't get your services, then oh well. And without oversight and without advocates like us, you just see so many people not get the treatment that they need. So I think that's the difficult part to translate, is that how could a child go into the system with IDD or mental health and it be diagnosed and identified, which Jolene said the diagnostics anyway is really horrible in any system. But how could the state know that this child has IDD or mental health and not provide accurate services? And they know that. I don't understand either. I don't know.
Well, and I would say my response to that would be, these are not places. This is a clear example of, this is not a space to educate kids. These are not the professionals who, that within that framework, it's not conducive to those, to learning and to those supported services.
And one thing I would add to that is, at the level of crisis that we're at now, where a child's being held for 23 hours a day in a cell on the weekends, they're not complying with a lot of rules that are in place for how you're supposed to handle the incarceration of a youth. So that alone makes it so that simple tweaks and policy reforms that keep coming up at the legislature are just it's just a joke to even propose those in this climate right now.
Yeah. Renee, yes, did you have another question?
Well, it's not a question. I just want to, first of all, I don't know much about the juvenile justice system. I'm really new to this. And I was wondering at first why this was even on the CTD, Raise Your Voice, because I thought, wait a minute, what does that have to do with disability? So thank you, because you really enlightened me to what's going on, because I had no idea. The other thing that concerns me is that if they don't receive treatment in juvenile, then, I mean, they're going to end up becoming adults with mental health issues, and they go into prisons and jails where they still don't receive treatment. And it seems like a perpetual problem. I mean, you don't turn 18 and grow out of it and then become an adult and go to work. I mean, it's just going to be, it just continues on. And I wonder if some of them end up homeless as well, because they can't go home and they have no other place to go. And I'm just wondering, but if any of you know what the rate of the homeless is with these juveniles when they turn 18 or become an adult. And if you don't have the answer, that's fine. I'm just wondering out loud.
Yeah, Alycia, do you have any of the rates for homelessness for kids that are aging out of TJJD?
That is an excellent question. I don't have it and I need to get it. So thank you for asking it, because I that's a really important question. We do know that a lot of kids who go into TJJD are going in because of their homelessness, as you know, something that occurred as a result of being homeless. But I don't have the information on exiting, and that actually might be very difficult to get a hold of because of the lack of services and reentry for youth, right? So it might be difficult for us to even know what happens to a youth once they exit TJJD. So another part.
You know, I ride the bus a lot. I'm in a wheelchair, and I use the Metro, Capital Metro quite a bit. And when I'm downtown, I see quite a few kids, and I don't mean like under 17, but probably 17, 18, you know, that are homeless or they're doing drugs, or they seem very hostile. And you know, I worry about them in some way, because I'm like, well, they're just like lost children, you know. And I thought, why are so many young people homeless? What are they doing out here? And you know, so I just was wondering about that some things fail them. And I think it starts with when they enter school, honestly.
And thank you, Renee. I love that you're here, and I love that everybody showed up for this Raise Your Voice, because sometimes youth justice and criminal justice kind of isn't always on our radar in the disability community, but understanding that like Alycia mentioned earlier, up to 80% of kids in TJJD have some type of IDD or mental health, and certainly in county jails and criminal justice, like you said, it's a perpetuating cycle. So I love that you're here and that we're working on these issues at CTD, because it is a crisis for our kids, especially. So thank you so much for being here. Kenneth, were you going to say anything?
Yes, I just wanted to say this time, and I'm glad I joined in today. It is somewhat new to me about what's happening today, but I can look back when I volunteered in the school district, years ago, where the counselor, as I went there to volunteer, through my job mainly back when, and I would help with planning career days and all that. That's for high school, but even in the lower class grades, I would say, I've witnessed children acting out, and a number of people just automatically think this kid is a problem, they have trouble. They don't try to identify what's really going on. It could be some things happening at home, or we just shove those kids to the side at times, and then they are crying out for help, and people just call them bad at times, and then they begin to get into more trouble at times when it could have been dealt with at a younger age. And so I'm just glad that you all are caring enough and right there on the ground. And I want to join in any way I can to help to educate, learn more, and educate the general public and our legislature to step in somehow. Because if there's not adequate oversight, this will continue to happen, and it will get worse, and so many kids will just suffer, and throughout their lives, and go into adulthood and feel lost. And like nobody cares, because they're being excluded in a number of ways, instead of somebody showing care and concern where they could be helped at an early stage, possibly.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kenneth.
I have a question.
Gwenda, go ahead.
Are these police officers having any kind of training on how to deal with these kids that have these special problems?
Go ahead, Jolene.
Oh, no, I was going to say, so the short answer is no. There are a lot of partner organizations that, we all have advocated for training. I've even facilitated training for the crisis intervention team and in Austin Police Department, and I know that there are some other organizations who are providing these trainings for free, but in terms of them being mandatory, no. And when we're talking about training at the campus level or the district level with the district PD or the school resource officers who may be interacting with these kids. No. It's optional, but yeah, that's nothing across the board.
But I have a son who's 51 years old, and he has a traumatic brain injury, and he got into some problems with the Circle K that's around the corner, and he was accused of stealing, and they called the police, and of course they took him downtown. And when I was notified that that's where he was, come and get him right now, come and get him. So we went downtown, and of course they weren't going to let us just come and get him. We got the bail bondsman, we went through the whole bit. But he has seizures. And so one of the ladies from the jail called me and they said, bring us the medicine for the seizure. So we went back down there, took the medicine. And when I got down there, there was a gentleman police officer and he goes, there's no way I'm going to take that medication from you. He goes, I don't know what that is. I said, it's in the bottles, with the names on it. And of course, he wouldn't take it. Meanwhile, my son is in the back and he is having a fit because he's afraid he's going to have a seizure. So story short, we ended up getting it out the next morning. But when we got home, his chest was just, you could tell he had been beat up, either kicked or punched. And I'm sure that he was probably giving them all kinds of problems and they didn't understand.
Right.
And so he was the one that was getting beat up.
Yeah.
We went to court, they laughed at the whole thing. They threw it out. They said that was stupid to waste, the government's time to even do it. But that's the issue that we're having, is that these things are happening and they don't really know how to handle it until they get into the system. And then, like I said, it was thrown out, which was a good thing for us. But he was all beat up.
Yeah, I will say that, there have been a lot of initiatives, and mental health officers there are mental health officers who have specific training. Those are always the ones that we at least hope in any instance, where an officer is called, that they're the ones who are arriving, but we also know that's not always the case. But, like I said, I think there have been a lot of initiatives that we would like to see continue to gain ground, so that they're not ending up like your experience, Gwenda, where, they're not ending up being arrested. Yeah, Jen, did you have anything? I know that we're right about time. We can stay on a little bit longer, but I do want to make sure that we have an opportunity to thank our sponsors. These are the folks who support the work that we do, so that we can continue to have these sessions and these conversations and talk about these important issues. So I'll go ahead and thank our sponsors: Amerigroup, BristolMyersSquibb, United Healthcare, Superior Health Plan, AbbVie, Touch of Class, Amgen, AstraZeneca, GRAIL, and We Work for Health, Texas. And as I said, we can hang out for a few more minutes, but I just want to be mindful of others' time.
Yeah, thank you, Jolene. I was just fixing to tell you that we were pretty closing in on time, and I know that people have other meetings and other obligations, and I just wanted to thank Alycia and everybody from the Texas Center for Justice and Equity taking the lead on the campaign to finish the 5, to close those 5 facilities. And CTD has your full support and my support personally, as it's something deeply personal for me. And Gwenda, I just want to say, look forward to our other Raise Your Voice. We're going to be doing ones just on criminal justice and the very issues that you were talking about. We're going to dig into policy changes at county jails, because your experience, unfortunately, is many other people's experience. So, Taylor, I saw you came off mute. If you wanted to say anything.
I am a person with a physical and speech disability. I grew up in West Texas and graduated from UT. I work for the organization, and I work for a lot of things. I work for institutions for criminal justice and disability. And I just want to tell you that we have a curriculum, and I gave you the website, and if it would be helpful, I could put you in touch with my supervisor who created the curriculum.
Yeah, Taylor, thank you. I saw that, and I am a little familiar with Pathways to Justice, and I have heard only amazing things about that curriculum. So I appreciate you sharing that and putting the links in the chat.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just wanted to say thank you all for being here today and having me. And I would love to see all of you at our first coalition call on Wednesday night. Maddie, our incredible comms manager, put the link for that in the chat, so you can register and just find out more about what you could do to be involved this legislative session in any capacity, because even the things that you all have shared today have been so helpful. And in order for us to make something transformational happen, it's going to take a lot of people doing a lot of work. So the more the merrier. Please join.